No man will ever choose her, Corliss Ashby said, loud enough for the whole breakfast room to hear. She did not whisper it. She did not look ashamed. She said it the way a person announces the weather, as if it were simply a fact that everyone else already knew and only needed reminding of. Wren Ashby did not look up from her plate. Her hand tightened around her spoon, but her face stayed still, because she had learned a long time ago that her stepmother's words landed softer when Wren gave her nothing to push against. "Corliss," said Della, the elder of the two stepsisters, in a voice that pretended to scold but did not mean it, "must you say it at the table?" "I say it because it is kind," Corliss answered. "Better she hears it from me, plainly, than from strangers cruelly. The world will not soften its opinion of her. Someone in this house should prepare her for that." Nora, the younger stepsister, said nothing. She only smiled into her tea, the way she always did when her mother spoke, as though she found the whole scene entertaining rather than sharp. Wren set down her spoon. She reached instead for the teacup in front of her, an old one, chipped along the handle, the only piece left from her mother's set that had not been sold or broken or given away over the years. She turned it slowly between her fingers, feeling the rough edge where the china had cracked. It was easier to look at the cup than to look at Corliss. "I have letters to answer," Wren said and stood. "Sit down," Corliss said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if she had shouted. "We are discussing the season. You are part of this family, whatever else you are. You will sit." Wren sat. The house had once belonged to her father. Wren remembered it that way still, though he had been gone 3 years now, and in that time the rooms had slowly stopped feeling like his. The portraits in the hall had been rearranged so that his likeness hung in a darker corner, and Corliss's own father, a man Wren had never met, now looked out from the best wall in the study. Small changes. Nothing anyone could call unfair if you only looked at one thing at a time. "The Marrow Ball is in 11 days, Corliss went on, addressing Della and Nora now, as if Wren had already left the room. "Della, your blue silk needs no alteration. Nora, I have spoken to the seamstress about the green. We will have both of you turned out beautifully." "And Wren?" Nora asked, not because she cared, but because she liked to watch what her mother would say. Corliss did not even pause. "Wren has her mother's gray. It is perfectly serviceable." The gray dress was 4 years old. It had been let out once already and could not be let out again. Wren knew this because she had checked the seams herself, quietly, the week before, already guessing what the answer would be when she asked for anything new. "I don't need a new gown," Wren said. "I wasn't planning to attend." "Of course you're attending," Corliss said. "It would look strange if you did not. People would ask why the eldest Ashby girl stayed home. They might imagine something wrong with this household. No, you will come. You will simply understand, going in, that a ball is not a place where certain outcomes are likely for certain young women. It costs nothing to understand that in advance. It saves disappointment later." Della looked for a moment, as though she might say something in Wren's defense. She did not. Wren picked the cup back up. It was empty now, had been empty for some minutes, but she held it anyway, turning it, running her thumb along the chip in the handle, and she let the room's conversation move on without her, the way water moves around a stone it cannot lift. Later in the hallway outside the breakfast room, Margaret the housekeeper found Wren standing very still, looking at nothing in particular. "Don't let her get under your skin, miss," Margaret said quietly. "She talks that way about everyone. She talked that way about her own sister once before that lady married better than Corliss ever did. It isn't about you, it's about her." "I know," Wren said. And she did know, in the part of her mind that reasoned things through calmly. But knowing a thing and feeling it were 2 different rooms in the same house, and Wren had not yet found the door between them. "You have your mother's steadiness," Margaret added. "That woman in there mistakes it for weakness. It isn't. Steadiness is what carries a person through a storm. Loud things get knocked over first." Wren managed a small smile. "You always know what to say." "I've had 30 years of practice not saying what I actually think in this house," Margaret said, and went back to her work before Wren could laugh out loud. That evening, Wren sat by the window in her room with a ledger open on her lap, the household accounts her father had once kept, and which no one else seemed willing to manage now. She was good with numbers. She liked how they did not lie, how a column either balanced or it did not, with no room for a clever remark to change the outcome. She liked, too, that this work was hers alone, something Corliss had no interest in and therefore no interest in taking from her. Down the corridor, she could hear Della and Nora talking about the ball, about which gentleman might be there, about the new Duke of Marrow, who had inherited his title only 3 years before and who, by every account that reached the house, wanted nothing to do with any of it. He did not attend most invitations. When he did attend, he left early, spoke to almost no one, and gave interviewers and gossiping mothers exactly nothing to work with. He was, by the general opinion of every drawing room in the county, extremely rude. "They say he'll marry eventually, out of duty, and not a moment before," Della was saying. "Mother thinks he might look our way this season." "Mother thinks everyone might look our way," Nora said, and they both laughed. Wren closed the ledger. She was not thinking about the Duke. She was thinking about the gray dress hanging in her wardrobe, worn thin at the elbows, and about the elder version of herself who used to believe that patience and quiet correctness would eventually be rewarded by someone noticing. She was 22 now. She had mostly stopped believing that, not bitterly, just quietly, the way a person stops expecting rain in a dry season and learns instead to carry water from somewhere else. She thought, too, about her father, and the way he used to find her in this same window seat when she was younger, and tell her that the world was full of people who confused loudness for strength, and that she should never let anyone convince her she was less because she did not perform herself for a room. She had believed him completely once. She wanted to believe him still. A knock came at the door. It was Nora alone, which was unusual. "I only wanted to say," Nora said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, not quite meeting Wren's eyes, "that I don't agree with everything Mother says. At breakfast, I mean, I know I laugh. It's easier to laugh than to argue with her. You understand that, don't you?" "I understand it," Wren said. "You should still come to the ball," Nora added. "In the gray or in anything, you should come." It was, in its own small and imperfect way, the kindest thing anyone in that family had said to Wren in some time, and she held onto it after Nora had gone, the way she held onto the chipped cup, because it was something real in a house full of things that were merely convenient. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake going over the numbers in her head, not the household numbers this time, but a different kind of arithmetic entirely, the kind that measured how much longer she could live in a house where her worth was announced at breakfast like a weather report, and what it would cost her, in every sense, to eventually leave it. She had no fortune of her own. She had no husband, no prospects that Corliss considered credible, and no relation willing to take her in. What she had was a ledger she understood better than anyone else in the house, a mother's dress that no longer fit quite right, and a stubborn, quiet certainty that she was not, in fact, the thing her stepmother said she was at breakfast, however many mornings it took for the rest of the world to notice. She thought about the years before her father died, when the house had felt entirely different, when his laugh used to carry down the stairs before he even reached the landing, and when Corliss had not yet learned every corner of the household well enough to redraw its lines so quietly that no one could point to the exact moment the redrawing happened. Wren remembered the week after the funeral most clearly, not because it had been the saddest week, though it had been that too, but because it had been the week Corliss first began speaking about the future of the household in a voice that included everyone but somehow served only 3 of its members. It had started small. A room reassigned, an allowance quietly adjusted, nothing any outsider could call theft, only management, always management, until one day Wren looked up and found she owned almost nothing in that house that Corliss had not, at some point, decided to let her keep. She did not resent her stepsisters for it, not truly. Della and Nora had not built the arrangement. They had only been born into a mother who built it around them, the way a person is born into weather rather than choosing it. It was Corliss alone Wren held responsible, and even then, less with anger than with the tired, clear-eyed understanding of someone who had simply stopped expecting fairness and had learned instead to expect management, and to plan her own small freedoms around its edges. 11 days, she thought, watching the dark shape of the wardrobe across the room. 11 days until the ball. She did not know yet that in 11 days, everything about how this house saw her would begin, slowly and then all at once, to come apart. She only knew, lying there in the dark, that she intended to go. Not because Corliss had ordered it. Because she had decided quietly on her own that she was tired of being spoken about instead of spoken to, and a ballroom full of strangers who did not know her stepmother's opinion of her was, strange as it sounded, the safest room she could imagine walking into. Downstairs, long after the house had gone quiet, Corliss sat alone in the study beneath the portrait of her own father, going over her own private arithmetic. 2 daughters to marry well. A household income that depended more than she liked to admit on connections she did not fully control. And an eldest stepdaughter who asked for nothing, complained of nothing, and therefore, in Corliss's calculation, could be given nothing, and no one would ever think to question it. It was not cruelty, exactly, the way Corliss understood her own actions. It was management. She believed in the specific and airless way that frightened people often believe, that there was only so much room at the top of any world, and that every door opened for Wren was a door closed to Della or to Nora. She did not examine this belief too closely. Examining it would have meant admitting how much of it had nothing to do with her stepdaughters at all, and everything to do with her own fear of what would happen to a widow with 2 daughters, and no name of her own, if the season went badly. She had no way of knowing, sitting there under her father's painted eyes, that in 11 days a duke known across 3 counties for wanting nothing from anyone would walk directly past her own daughters, across a crowded ballroom floor, toward the one girl in gray she had spent years insisting no one would ever choose. The candles in the Marrow ballroom had been lit since 4 in the afternoon, and by the time the Ashby carriage arrived, the heat of them had already turned the air thick and golden, so that everyone inside seemed to shimmer slightly, like figures seen through water. Wren stood at the edge of the room in her mother's gray dress, and for the first 10 minutes, no one spoke to her at all. She did not mind it as much as she thought she would. There was something almost peaceful in being unseen, after a lifetime of being seen and found wanting. She watched Della and Nora sweep into the crowd on Corliss's careful direction, watched her stepmother position herself near the punch table where the most useful conversations tended to happen, and she let herself simply exist for a moment, unwatched, unremarked upon, a gray shape at the edge of a bright room. Across that same room, Julian Vane, 7th Duke of Marrow, was doing his best impression of a man enjoying himself, which was to say he was failing at it openly and without apology. He had been cornered 4 times in the last half hour, once by a mother with 2 unmarried daughters, and a great deal to say about the weather in a way that somehow always circled back to marriage. Once by a former schoolmate who wanted money disguised as a business proposal. Once by a man who wished to discuss horses for longer than any horse deserved. And once, most recently, by his own aunt, who had told him plainly that if he did not select a wife by the end of the season, she would select one for him, and he would not enjoy her taste. "You look," said Arthur Penn, his oldest friend and the only person in the room Julian actually wanted to be speaking to, "like a man being slowly boiled." "I feel like a man being slowly boiled," Julian said. "Then dance with someone. It ends the conversations faster than standing here glaring at the orchestra." "I have no interest in dancing with anyone your aunt has already picked out for me." "Then pick someone she hasn't," Arthur said, and nodded toward the far side of the room, mostly to make a point rather than an actual suggestion. Julian followed the gesture without much interest, expecting nothing, and found instead a young woman in gray standing alone near the wall, entirely still, entirely apart from the noise around her, watching the room the way a person watches whether they cannot control and have decided not to worry about. She was not dressed for this room. Her gown was out of fashion by at least 3 seasons, and she was making no effort at all to disguise that fact, or to make herself smaller because of it. "Who is that?" Julian said, not quite a question. Arthur followed his gaze. "I don't know. Someone's companion, most likely, judging by the dress, or a poor relation brought along because it would look worse to leave her home." Julian did not answer. He was still watching her, and what struck him was not her stillness exactly, but the particular quality of it, the way she seemed to be choosing it rather than suffering it, which was a different thing entirely from every other still, unhappy face he had seen in ballrooms all season. He crossed the room before he had entirely decided to. Wren saw him coming and assumed, reasonably, that he was walking toward someone behind her, and so she did not move, and did not look away from the dancers, until he stopped directly in front of her, and the space where he might have kept walking simply did not open up. "You're not dancing," he said. "No one has asked me," Wren said, which was true and simple, and she realized only after saying it, possibly rude, though she found she did not much care. "I find that surprising," he said. "Why?" He seemed, for a moment, genuinely to consider the question, rather than offering the easy compliment the moment invited. "Because you're the only person in this room who looks like they'd rather be somewhere honest," he said finally. "Everyone else is performing. You're not." Wren studied him properly for the first time. He was tall, dressed well but without ornament, and his expression carried none of the practiced charm she had watched other gentlemen wear all evening like a second coat. If anything, he looked faintly tired, the way a person looks after having the same conversation too many times in one night. "You must be someone's companion," he added, "brought along for appearances." Wren did not correct him immediately. There was something almost restful in being briefly nobody, unattached to the Ashby name and everything that came stitched into it. "Something like that," she said. "Then you have my sympathy. This is not an easy room to be nobody in." "It's easier than being somebody in it," Wren said, and for the first time all evening, she saw something shift in his face, a flicker of real attention, as if she had said something he had not expected anyone at this ball to understand. Across the room, Corliss had noticed exactly one thing in the last 30 seconds, and it was not encouraging. The Duke of Marrow, the very Duke she had spent 3 weeks positioning her own daughters near, had crossed an entire ballroom to speak to Wren. "Who is he talking to?" Corliss said sharply, "to no one in particular." "That's Wren, Mother," Nora said, sounding almost delighted, which earned her a look that promised a private conversation later. Corliss began moving through the crowd, smiling the whole way, the way a person smiles when they are furious and cannot show it. By the time she reached them, Julian had asked Wren, plainly and without ceremony, whether she would like to walk the length of the terrace, where the air was cooler and the noise of the orchestra thinner. And Wren, against every instinct that told her this sort of thing did not happen to her, had said yes. "Your Grace," Corliss said, arriving with a curtsy so smooth it looked rehearsed because it was, "I see you've met my stepdaughter." Julian's expression did not change much, but something in it sharpened. "Stepdaughter," he repeated. "Wren," Cullis said, with the particular warmth she reserved for moments when an audience was watching. "My late husband's daughter. She rarely attends these things. I'm so glad she came out tonight." It was, on its surface, a perfectly kind sentence. Wren heard, underneath it, every other sentence Cullis had ever said about her, and understood immediately that her stepmother was not pleased, and was already calculating how to manage what had just happened. "I was about to walk the terrace with her," Julian said, in a tone that was not quite a question and not quite permission-seeking, more a simple statement of fact offered to a woman who had not been part of the decision. How lovely, Cullis said. Wren does enjoy fresh air. She finds ballrooms rather overwhelming, I'm afraid. She isn't accustomed to this sort of attention. It was a small cruelty, dressed as concern, the kind Cullis had perfected over years of practice, and Wren felt her face grow warm, not from embarrassment exactly, but from the familiar, tired frustration of watching someone narrate her into a smaller shape than the one she actually occupied. I manage attention perfectly well, Wren said quietly, when it isn't being managed for me. Cullis's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes did. Julian, watching this exchange with the careful attention of a man who had spent his whole life reading the difference between what people said and what they meant, offered his arm. "The terrace, then," he said, "before the air gets any warmer in here." Wren took his arm. She did not look back at Cullis as they walked, though she could feel her stepmother's gaze on her back the entire way across the room, sharp as a pin through fabric. The terrace was cooler, as promised, and quieter, the music behind them fading into something distant and manageable. Julian did not speak right away, and Wren found she did not mind the silence, which was itself unusual, since silence with most people felt like something she had to fill. "Your stepmother," he said eventually, "seemed very interested in explaining you to me." "She's very good at that," Wren said. "Explaining me, it's practically a talent." "And is she accurate?" Wren considered the question longer than she meant to. "She's accurate about the facts and wrong about everything that matters," she said finally. "I do find ballrooms overwhelming sometimes. I'm not accustomed to attention. Those things are true, but she says them the way you describe a piece of furniture that doesn't fit the room, not unkindly exactly, just finally." "That sounds worse than unkind," Julian said. "Unkind at least admits it's being unkind." Wren looked at him properly then, surprised, because it was the first time in longer than she could easily remember that someone had understood the particular shape of Cullis's cruelty, without her having to explain it twice. "Most people don't hear it," she said. "They hear a mother being practical about a plain stepdaughter and they move on." "I'm not most people," Julian said, and there was no arrogance in it, only a kind of tired honesty. "I've spent 3 years being explained to rooms full of people who wanted something from me. I recognize the sound of it when I hear it done to someone else." They walked the length of the terrace twice, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered, the way two people do when they have decided, without quite admitting it to themselves, that they would like to keep talking. Wren learned that he disliked ballrooms for reasons that had nothing to do with the dancing, and everything to do with being treated as a title rather than a person since the day he inherited it. Julian learned that Wren kept the household accounts, because she was better at numbers than anyone else in her family, and because it was the one thing in that house that was entirely hers. "Tell me something no one else in that ballroom knows about you," Julian said, at one point, stopping near the terrace rail. Wren considered it seriously, the way she considered most questions asked of her sincerely, which was rare enough that she had not fully trained herself out of taking them seriously. "I keep a second ledger," she said finally. "Not the household accounts, my own. What I'm owed for the work no one asked me to do and what I'd need to leave if I ever decided to. I've never told anyone that. It sounds foolish," said aloud. "It doesn't sound foolish," Julian said. "It sounds like someone who intends to survive whatever happens to her, regardless of who else decides the terms. And you, something no one in that ballroom knows about you." "I hate being called Your Grace," he said. "I've hated it since the day my father died and it started applying to me. It sounds like a costume someone else is still wearing, and I'm only standing inside it." "What would you rather be called?" "Julian," he said. "Just Julian. No one's used it in 3 years without meaning something by it." "Julian, then," Wren said, and something in the simple, deliberate use of his own name, offered without flattery or calculation, seemed to land on him more heavily than anything else said to him all season. Neither of them mentioned the gray dress again. Neither of them needed to. When Cullis finally located them again, nearly half an hour later, she found her stepdaughter laughing, actually laughing, at something the Duke of Marrow had said, and the sight of it struck her with a coldness she did not examine too closely, because examining it would have meant admitting that the plan she had built for this season, brick by careful brick, had just cracked directly down the middle, in a place she had never thought to guard. "Wren," she called, her voice bright and carrying, "we really must be going. It's grown quite late." It was not, in fact, late, but Wren understood the sentence for what it was, and so, apparently, did Julian, whose expression cooled by exactly one careful degree as he offered Wren his arm back toward the ballroom. "I hope," he said quietly just before they reached the doors, "that I might call on you, properly, not on a terrace arranged by accident." Wren looked at him, at this tired, honest, entirely unimpressed by titles Duke, who had walked across a crowded room toward the one gray dress no one else had bothered to notice, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight for longer than she could remember. "I'd like that," she said. Behind them, Cullis watched the exchange with a smile fixed carefully in place. Already, in the private and airless arithmetic she kept locked behind her eyes, beginning to calculate exactly what she would need to do to make sure it never happened again. The first time Julian Vane called at the Ushby house, Cullis received him in the good parlor with a smile so warm it could have melted frost off a window, and by the time he left an hour later, she had already decided on a new approach. She could not stop the calls. A duke calling on a household was not a thing a widow with 2 unmarried daughters could easily refuse, not without inviting exactly the kind of talk she had spent years avoiding. So she did not refuse him. Instead, she managed him, the way she managed everything, quietly and from several directions at once. "Della," she said, the morning after his second visit, "you must be present when His Grace calls. It looks strange, 3 young women in a house and only one ever in the room." Della, who had no particular interest in the Duke but every interest in pleasing her mother, agreed without argument. Nora agreed as well, though with rather more curiosity than obedience, since she had grown genuinely fond of watching Wren's quiet, careful happiness these past weeks, and was not entirely certain she wanted to help undo it. So it became a pattern. Julian would call, and find not Wren alone in the parlor, but the whole household arranged around her, Della asking after his horses, Cullis steering the conversation toward safe and flattering ground, Nora watching everything with the particular sharpness of a girl who noticed far more than anyone gave her credit for. Julian bore it with the patience of a man who had spent his whole adult life being managed by people who wanted something from him, and who had learned, therefore, precisely how to see through it. "Your mother arranges rooms the way a general arranges troops," he said to Wren once quietly, while Cullis was occupied pouring tea for Della's benefit rather than his own. "She's had a great deal of practice," Wren said. "So have I at being arranged around," Julian said. "I generally know when it's happening." Still, the visits continued, and Wren found that even inside the careful choreography Cullis built around them, she and Julian managed to find their own private language, small glances across a crowded parlor, a shared dry comment about the weather that meant something entirely different from what it said. It was not the terrace again, not that easy, unguarded conversation under open sky, but it was something, and Wren held onto it the way she held onto most good things in her life, quietly, without announcing how much it mattered. Corliss noticed the glances, too. She noticed everything. "He is being polite," she told Wren one evening after Julian had gone, in a tone that pretended to be gentle guidance and was, underneath, something considerably sharper. "Dukes are trained in courtesy from the cradle. He would be just as attentive to a chair if the chair happened to be sitting in the right spot." "I don't think that's true," Wren said. "You wouldn't," Corliss said. You've had so little practice reading men that I understand the confusion. But I have watched this sort of thing many times, my dear, and I promise you, it ends the same way it always does. He will marry someone suitable, someone with a name that adds to his, not one that requires explaining. It is simply how these things work. Wren said nothing. She had learned over years that arguing with Corliss rarely changed the outcome and only cost her more than the silence did. But that night, lying awake, she found herself turning the words over anyway, unable to set them down, the way a person keeps touching a bruise to check whether it still hurts. The following week, Julian arrived at the house earlier than expected, before the family had properly assembled in the parlor, and found himself briefly alone in the hallway, waiting to be announced. It was there, through the half-open door of the small sitting room, that he heard Corliss speaking to Della, unaware he had arrived. "You mustn't take it personally when he chooses her," Corliss was saying. "Some men develop a fondness for a project. A plain, sensible girl who asks nothing of them feels safe after a season of being chased by every ambitious mother in the county. It won't last. He'll tire of the safety soon enough and want something that actually reflects well on him. Wren was never built to hold a man's interest for long. Even her own father used to say she took after no one in particular. A face like a held breath, he called her once, not unkindly, but it stayed with me." Della murmured something too quiet for Julian to hear. "I only tell you this," Corliss went on, "so you don't waste this season sulking over a man who will come to his senses eventually. No man will ever truly choose her, Della. Not for keeping. He'll enjoy her company the way one enjoys a strange, quiet room, and then he'll go looking for a house that suits his name." Julian did not move from where he stood. He felt something settle in his chest, cold and very still, the particular quiet that comes not from an absence of anger, but from anger folding itself carefully away to be used later, deliberately, rather than spent all at once on a woman not worth the effort of losing his composure over. He was announced a moment later, and walked into the parlor with his usual unreadable calm. And if Corliss noticed anything different in his manner that afternoon, she read it wrongly, as simple boredom. He said very little during the visit. He watched Wren more closely than usual, though, noticing things he had not fully let himself notice before, the way she deflected every compliment aimed her way, the way she seemed to brace slightly whenever her stepmother spoke, an old, practiced flinch worn smooth by years of use. He understood, watching her, that she had likely never heard the sentence he had just overheard, not in those exact words, but she had heard its cousins 100 times before, in 100 careful, deniable disguises, and had simply learned to keep walking through rooms that said them. He did not confront Corliss that day. He was too controlled a man for that, and too aware that a public argument would only harm Wren more than it harmed her stepmother, giving the county gossip about a duke quarreling with a widow over her stepdaughter, exactly the kind of talk Corliss thrived on managing to her advantage. Instead, on his way out, he found a moment alone with Wren in the hallway, while Corliss was occupied bidding farewell to an imaginary urgency in the kitchen that kept her conveniently elsewhere. "Your father," Julian said carefully, "what was he like?" Wren looked surprised by the question, coming as it did from nowhere she could trace. "Kind," she said. "Quiet. He used to say the loudest people in a room were usually the least certain of themselves. I think of it often." "Did he ever call you a held breath?" The question landed strangely, and Wren's face changed, confusion first, then something more careful. "Why would you ask that?" "No reason," Julian said, and the lie sat awkwardly in his mouth, unfamiliar territory for a man who preferred bluntness to almost everything else. "I only wondered what he thought of you." "He thought I was steady," Wren said slowly. "He used that word, steady, not a held breath. I don't know where you'd have heard that." Julian said nothing further on the matter, only pressed her hand briefly at parting, longer than strict manners required, and left with a courtesy so precise it might have looked, to anyone watching, exactly like every other visit he had made that season. It was not, however, like every other visit. Something in him had shifted quietly, permanently, the way a lock shifts when the correct key finally turns. And Wren, walking back into the parlor without any idea what had just been overheard on her behalf, felt only the faint, unplaceable sense that something in the house had changed, without being able to say what. That night, Julian sat alone in his study at Marrow House, a glass of unfinished brandy in front of him, going over what he had heard with the same careful attention he gave to any problem worth solving properly. He had known, since inheriting his title at 26, that people spoke of him in rooms he was not meant to hear, weighing his worth in pounds and land and bloodlines, as though the man attached to the title were simply an inconvenient detail to be managed around. He had grown a kind of armor against it, over 3 tired years, a coldness that most of the county mistook for genuine rudeness and had, largely, stopped trying to see past. What he had not expected this season was to feel that same old fury on someone else's behalf, sharper and stranger than anything he had felt defending himself. He turned the memory over, the particular careful cruelty of Corliss's phrase, a project, and understood, with the clarity of a man finally admitting something he had been circling for weeks, that he did not think of Wren Ashby as a project at all. He thought of the terrace, the honest stillness of her, the dry humor she offered in a house that gave her nothing to laugh about, and yet somehow could not fully quiet in her. He thought of the way she managed the household accounts with an easy competence no one in her family seemed to value, and the way she had said so simply that a ballroom was easier to be nobody in than to be somebody in it, and how that single sentence had told him more about her life than an hour of Corliss's careful narration ever had. He did not sleep well that night either, though for very different reasons than Wren usually did not sleep. He was not turning over hurt. He was turning over a decision, slowly becoming certain, the particular steady certainty of a man who did not often let himself want things, and who had discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he wanted this one very much indeed. 2 days after that overheard conversation, though she still did not know it had happened, Wren found Nora sitting alone in the small sitting room, unusually quiet, turning a piece of embroidery over in her hands without actually working the needle through it. "You've been sitting there a long time," Wren said, settling beside her. "I've been thinking about something Mother said," Nora admitted. "About you. I won't repeat it. It wasn't kind, and I don't think you need to hear it repeated even to be told it was unkind." "You don't have to protect me from her opinions," Wren said. "I've had years of practice absorbing them." "That's exactly what worries me," Nora said. "That you've had practice, that you've gotten good at it. I used to think it meant you were strong, watching you take it and never once say anything back. Lately, I've started thinking it just means she's had a lot of time to wear you down and call the wearing something else." Wren did not answer immediately. It was, she realized, one of the more perceptive things anyone in that house had ever said to her. And it came from the stepsister she had always assumed cared the least. "What would you have me do instead?" Wren asked. "Argue with her at every breakfast. It changes nothing. It only costs me more." "I don't know," Nora admitted. "I only know that watching someone absorb something for years doesn't actually make the thing true. It just makes it quiet. I don't think quiet and untrue are the same, even if they look similar from across a room." It was a small conversation, over almost as soon as it began, but Wren carried it with her the rest of that week, turning it over the way she turned over the chipped teacup, because it was, in its own way, a kind of gift, one stepsister finally saying plainly what the household had spent years pretending not to notice. The next morning, he called for his steward, a careful, watchful man named Edward who had managed the Marrow accounts long before Julian had ever held the title, and asked him a set of questions about a debt he vaguely recalled hearing mentioned once, years ago, tied to the Ashby name and a loan his own late father had extended, generously and rather too casually, to Wren's father before his death. "It's an old debt, Your Grace," Edward said, surprised at the sudden interest. "Owed by the estate, technically, though I believe it passed to Mrs. Ashby's management upon her remarriage. We've never pressed it. Your father considered it a kindness, not a transaction." "I'd like the full details by the end of the week," Julian said. "Discreetly. I'm not looking to press anyone yet. I simply want to understand exactly what I'm holding, in case I ever need to hold it properly." Edward, who had served 2 dukes and learned not to ask questions he was not meant to ask, only bowed and went to fetch the ledgers, entirely unaware that he had just been handed the first quiet thread of a plan that would, before the season ended, unravel everything Corliss Ashby had spent years carefully sewing together. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, half the county seemed to know its contents before Wren herself had fully understood them. It claimed, in careful, deniable language, that Wren Ashby had been seen alone with a gentleman not her intended, late in the evening, unchaperoned, at an inn some distance from her home, on a night she could not clearly account for. It was signed by no one. It arrived at the homes of exactly the families most likely to repeat it, and by exactly no coincidence at all. It arrived the same week Julian Vane's calls at the Ashby house had become frequent enough that the whole county had begun to expect an announcement. Wren read her own copy 3 times before she understood that she was meant to have been at an inn she had never visited, on a night she could account for perfectly well, since she had spent it at home with the household ledgers, a fact Margaret could confirm and did, immediately and firmly, to anyone who asked. It did not matter. That was the particular cruelty of the thing. The truth of it mattered far less than the speed with which it spread, and by Thursday, an invitation Wren had been expecting to a small gathering at a neighboring house arrived instead as a polite, regretful note explaining that the numbers had unfortunately changed. "Someone wants this believed," Margaret said grimly, setting the note down. "This isn't ordinary gossip, miss. Ordinary gossip doesn't move this fast or land this precisely." Wren said nothing for a long moment. She was thinking of her stepmother's face at breakfast that morning, the particular soft sympathy she had worn while reading her own copy of the rumor, tutting gently about how unfair the world could be to a young woman with no one properly looking after her reputation. It could not be proven. That was the other cruelty of it. There was no signature, no clear source, nothing Wren could point to and say, "Here, this is where it began." Only a pattern, if she looked closely enough, of exactly whose interests it happened to serve. "I won't be able to stay here," Wren said quietly, more to herself than to Margaret. "Not if this spreads further. She'll say it reflects on the whole household. She'll say it's kinder for everyone if I go and stay with a distant relation for a while until it settles. She's probably already written the letter." She was right. Corliss had, in fact, already written it, a careful, sorrowful letter to a cousin twice removed in a county far enough away that no one there would have heard the rumor yet, explaining that dear Wren needed a change of air, for her own sake, and would arrive within the fortnight. Wren found the letter, unfinished, on the writing desk in the good parlor, and understood, reading it, exactly how quickly and completely her life in this house was being rearranged without her, the way it had always been rearranged without her, except this time the rearrangement led somewhere very far away and very lonely indeed. That night she packed a single bag, not because Corliss had told her to leave yet, but because she understood, with the particular clear-eyed calm of someone who has spent years learning to see the shape of things before they're announced, that the announcement was coming, and she preferred to meet it prepared rather than surprised. She counted the coins in her small savings box twice, and both times arrived at the same discouraging number. Not enough to travel far, not enough to live independently for more than a few careful weeks, but perhaps enough to reach an old friend of her mother's in the next county, a woman named Beatrice who had written kindly, if distantly, in the years since her father's death, and who might, if asked plainly, be willing to help. She did not cry while she packed. She had cried over smaller things than this in years past and found the crying changed nothing about the outcome, only left her tired afterward, and she needed, right now, to be anything but tired. She was folding the gray dress into the bag, the same one she had worn to the Marrow ball, when Nora appeared in her doorway, unannounced, her face pale. "You're leaving," Nora said. "It was not a question." "Not tonight," Wren said. "But soon, I think, before your mother has to say it out loud." "It isn't true," Nora said. "Whatever the letter says, I know it isn't true. You were here. I heard you in the study going over the accounts half the night." "I know," Wren said. "It doesn't seem to matter whether I know or whether you know." Nora crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, watching Wren fold the last of her few belongings with a kind of quiet, careful precision that seemed, somehow, worse than tears would have been. "I don't think Mother wrote it," Nora said carefully. "The letter, I mean. I don't think she'd risk her own name on something like that, but I think she was glad when it arrived. I saw her face when she read it. She wasn't shocked, Wren. She looked almost relieved." Wren did not answer. There was nothing useful to say to that, no way to make the observation less true by refusing to acknowledge it, and she had long since stopped expecting justice from a house that ran on management rather than fairness. The following afternoon, Wren walked into the village alone, needing air and distance from a house that suddenly felt smaller than it had a week before, and found herself standing outside the small stone church where her father was buried, though she had not consciously decided to walk there. She sat by his grave for a long while, saying nothing out loud, only running through the same tired arithmetic she had run through so many times before, the numbers that never quite balanced no matter how she arranged them. She thought about what he would have said, watching this happen to her, and decided, finally, that he would not have told her to fight the rumor loudly or to weep over it privately. He would have told her, in that quiet, steady voice she still heard sometimes in memory, that the truth does not need defending nearly as often as people believe it does. It only needs someone patient enough to still be standing there when the noise finally runs out of breath. She did not know, sitting there, that patience would not be required much longer, that the noise was already, several miles away, in the careful hands of a Duke's steward, being traced back to its source one household at a time. 3 days later, on the morning Wren had quietly planned to leave, a letter arrived, not for her, but for Corliss, delivered by a rider in Marrow livery, and whatever it contained changed her stepmother's face so completely and so suddenly that even Della noticed, over breakfast, and asked what was wrong. "Nothing," Corliss said, folding the letter with hands that were not quite steady. "Business, estate matters, nothing that concerns any of you." It concerned, in fact, exactly one matter. Delivered in language so precise and so carefully courteous that it left no room for misunderstanding. The old debt owed to the Marrow estate by Wren's late father, quietly inherited into Corliss's management upon her remarriage and never once mentioned in the years since, was, the letter explained, now due for review. His Grace regretted any inconvenience. His Grace understood such matters could be settled amicably, given time, provided the household in question remained, in every particular, above reproach, its members treated with the fairness and consideration one would expect of any respectable family. His Grace trusted this would not prove difficult. Corliss read it twice, and understood, with a coldness that settled somewhere beneath her ribs, exactly what was being said beneath the courteous language, and exactly whose name had somehow reached the ears of a duke who had never, as far as she knew, shown the slightest interest in her household finances until this precise week. She did not know, could not have known, that Julian had spent the past several days quietly confirming the rumor's origin, tracing it patiently back through 3 separate households, until it arrived, unmistakably, at a note in Corliss's own hand, sent under a name that was not quite hers but close enough, to the one family in the county certain to spread it fastest and furthest. He had not needed to prove it publicly. He had only needed to know it privately, and to let Corliss understand, in language courteous enough to survive any scrutiny, that he knew. That evening, without explanation, Corliss called Wren into the study. "There has clearly been some misunderstanding about the letter that arrived last week," Corliss said, choosing each word with visible care. "I have made inquiries. It appears to have been a malicious falsehood put about by someone with no real knowledge of your character. I intend to write to everyone who received a copy, correcting the record." Wren studied her stepmother's face for a long moment, understanding perfectly well that nothing about this correction had originated in any genuine change of heart, but unwilling, just this once, to refuse a kindness simply because of where it came from. "Thank you," Wren said. "And the letter to my cousin," Corliss added, not quite meeting Wren's eyes. "I don't believe there's any need to send it now, unless you wish to visit her regardless." "I don't," Wren said. "Good," Corliss said, and there the conversation ended, no apology offered, no acknowledgement of the relief she had felt reading the false rumor days before, only a careful, hurried repair of the damage, undertaken for reasons Wren did not yet understand, and would not fully understand until much later, when the whole shape of what had happened finally came into view. Wren unpacked the bag that night slowly, folding the gray dress back into the wardrobe where it had hung for years, and sat by the window for a long time afterward, turning the strange, sudden reversal over in her mind, unable to account for it, and not yet aware that somewhere across the county, a duke who preferred solving problems quietly to announcing his own good deeds had already decided that this was only the beginning of what he intended to do on her behalf. 6 weeks later, the same ballroom at Marrow House was lit again, the same candles, the same golden heavy air, and Wren Ashby stood near the same wall where she had once waited a full 10 minutes before anyone noticed her at all. This time she was not wearing gray. The dress was a deep, quiet blue, chosen not by Corliss and not for any season's fashion, but by Wren herself, with money that was, for the first time in her adult life, entirely her own, earned through an arrangement Julian had proposed with a bluntness she had come to recognize as one of his best qualities. He had discovered, through Edward, that the Marrow estate's accounts had grown sloppy under years of indifferent management, and had asked Wren plainly whether she would consider setting them right for proper payment before he had asked her anything else at all. "You're proposing marriage," Arthur had said to him, disbelieving, when Julian described the arrangement, "by offering her a job." "I'm proposing that she never again has to depend on anyone's goodwill for a roof over her head," Julian had answered. "The marriage question can wait until she wants to answer it as herself, not as someone with nowhere else to go." It had taken her 4 weeks to say yes to the position, and rather less time than that, though she would not admit exactly how much less, to understand that she wanted to say yes to considerably more than the position. Tonight, though, was not about the accounts. Julian found her exactly where he had found her the first time, though nothing else about the moment matched. He did not have to cross the room the way he had before, wondering who she belonged to. He simply walked to her, because it was where he always walked now, in any room they both occupied. "You're not standing against the wall out of habit tonight," he said. "I checked. You chose this spot on purpose." "I like this spot," Wren said. "It has a good view of the whole room. I can see everyone coming." "Including me." "Especially you," she said. "You're the easiest to spot. You still look like you'd rather be anywhere else." "Not tonight," he said, and something in the way he said it made her look at him more carefully. He did not kneel, and he did not make a speech, because he had learned over the past weeks that Wren distrusted grand gestures the way she distrusted most things offered too loudly and too suddenly, having spent a lifetime watching loud things turn out hollow. Instead, he reached into his coat and drew out a small, plain object and pressed it into her hand. It was a teacup, not new, Old, in fact, deliberately so, the handle chipped in almost exactly the same place as the one she still kept on her writing desk at home, the one that had survived her mother and her father, and every quiet arithmetic Corliss had ever performed at that family's breakfast table. "Edward found it," Julian said, "in an old set at Merrill House from my grandmother's time. I saw the chip and thought of you before I thought of anything sensible to say about it. I'm told that's a poor foundation for a proposal. I'm making it anyway." Wren turned the cup over in her hands, feeling the familiar rough edge of the chip beneath her thumb, and felt something in her chest come loose that had been held tightly closed since a breakfast table months before, since a sentence spoken loud enough for a whole room to hear. "No man will ever choose her," she said quietly, half to herself, testing the old words in her own mouth, seeing how little weight they carried now compared to how much they had once carried. "She was wrong," Julian said, "about the choosing and about the never. I'd like it on the record formally in front of this entire ballroom if necessary, that I am choosing you deliberately with my eyes open, having heard every unkind thing said about you and finding every single one of them false." "You're not asking a question," Wren said, though she was smiling now, in the particular unguarded way she rarely allowed herself in crowded rooms. "I'm telling you a fact," Julian said. "You may respond to it however you like." "Yes," Wren said, before he had even fully finished offering her the chance to think it over, because she had, in fact, already decided some weeks before, somewhere between the terrace and the accounts and the quiet way he had handled the rumor without ever making a public show of having handled it, and she saw no reason to make either of them wait any longer for a true thing to be spoken aloud. Across the room, Corliss Ashby watched the exchange from a position she had not chosen, near the edge of the floor rather than near the center of it, where she had spent years positioning herself carefully at every gathering that mattered. The debt had been settled, eventually, in full, with a courtesy that had somehow felt more like consequence than kindness, and in the weeks since, Corliss had noticed, with a discomfort she did not examine too closely, that invitations which had once arrived promptly now arrived late, or not at all, and that certain drawing rooms which had once welcomed her opinions now received them with a polite thinness that told her, without anyone saying it outright, that her usefulness in this particular arithmetic had quietly expired. She had not been ruined. Nothing so dramatic had happened to her, and nothing so dramatic would. But something smaller and, in its way, more lasting had shifted the particular currency she had always traded in, other people's opinion of her judgment, her taste, her authority over a household of young women, had lost a portion of its value. And there was no letter, no debt, no clever arrangement that could buy it back. Della, standing beside her mother, watched Wren and Julian across the room with an expression that held, for the first time in a long while, no envy at all, only a kind of tired relief, as though a weight she had not fully realized she was carrying had finally been set down. "She looks happy," Della said quietly. "She looks foolish," Cullis said, though the words came out without their usual conviction, thin and automatic, a habit rather than a belief. "Mother," Della said, in a voice Cullis had never quite heard from her before, careful but unmistakably firm, "I think it might be time to stop saying things like that." Nora, on Cullis's other side, said nothing at all, only watched Wren laugh at something Julian had said, the easy, unguarded laugh Nora remembered from the terrace all those weeks ago, and found herself, quietly, glad of it, without any need to announce the feeling to the room. Later, when the music had shifted to something slower, Nora crossed the floor and found Wren near the refreshment table, waiting her turn to be congratulated by half the room. "I wanted to say it properly," Nora said, "before all these other people say it better than I will. I'm glad, truly. And I wanted you to know that the conversation we had in the sitting room about quiet and untrue not being the same thing, I've thought about it every day since. I think it changed how I listen to my mother now. I don't absorb things the way I used to either." "That's the best gift anyone's given me tonight," Ren said, and meant it fully, more than she meant it about the ring already sitting on her hand or the cup still held in her palm, because a stepsister choosing to see clearly, after years of choosing not to, was a rarer and harder thing than any ballroom could offer. Della found her a moment later and said less, being less naturally given to saying things aloud, but pressed Ren's hand warmly and said only that she hoped, someday, someone would walk across a room for her the same way, and that she now understood, finally, what that particular kind of choosing was supposed to look like when it was real. Later that evening, when the dancing had thinned and the candles had burned low, Ren stepped out onto the same terrace where she and Julian had first walked, alone this time, the teacup still held carefully in her hand. She thought of her father and the window seat and the arithmetic she used to run through in the dark, measuring how much longer she could bear a house that valued her only by what she did not cost anyone. She thought of Mugrat's steady kindness and Nora's small, unexpected loyalty, and the particular chip in a teacup handle that had somehow followed her, in its way, all the way from one breakfast table to this terrace, to this evening, to this entirely different life waiting to begin. Julian found her there a few minutes later, exactly as he had the first time, though he did not need to cross a crowded room to do it now. He simply stepped through the doors and stood beside her, quiet, unhurried, the way he had learned over these past months that she liked best. "Regretting the cup already?" he asked. "No," Ren said. "I'm keeping it. Both of them, actually. The old one and this one. I want to remember exactly how far the distance is between what someone once said about me at a breakfast table and what turned out to be true." "And what turned out to be true?" Julian asked. Ren looked at him, at the ballroom glowing warm and golden behind them, at the whole strange, unlikely arithmetic of the last few months finally balancing, at last, in her favor. "That I was never the thing she said," Ren answered. "I was only waiting for someone to walk far enough across a room to notice." She did not need him to answer that. He simply took her hand, the one not holding the cup, and they stood there together on the terrace a while longer in no hurry at all, while somewhere behind them the last of the candles burned steadily down, and somewhere further back still, in a house that no longer had the power to decide her worth for her, a chipped teacup sat quietly on a writing desk, waiting for no one, needing nothing, exactly as it was.